Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Williamson, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of FCLT Global. We are a nonprofit organization originally known as Focusing Capital on the Long Term. Our mission is to rebalance capital markets to support a long-term sustainable economy, and our members are leading asset owners, asset managers, and companies from around the world. Thank you for joining us today for our conversation with Jay Clayton, moderated by Mark Wiseman, where we will discuss the growing role of ESG-related disclosures and non-traditional metrics. We're excited to welcome you to this important discussion and look forward to insights from our guests. Investors are seeking metrics and disclosures to evaluate a company's approach to sustainability and its drivers of long-term growth. The format of these metrics and disclosures has become a critical global discussion. Mark Wiseman will speak with Chairman Clayton about how issuers, investors, and standard setters can clarify and advance the development of appropriate disclosures and discourse around what really drives businesses in the long run. Today's equity investing is increasingly based on quantitative models. The extent that these broader disclosures can mesh with quantitatively driven investing is part of the debate. Many organizations, both in the US and in Europe, have done extensive work on disclosure frameworks, non-traditional metrics, or integrated reporting. These frameworks are targeted at particular stakeholders, including advocacy groups, customers, employees, policymakers, and investors. The issue of whether there can be a global standard or if national or regional standards will prevail is an important part of today's discussion, and we have attendees from 23 countries on the line. A quick housekeeping note. We have 60 minutes for this discussion. For the first 35 to 40 minutes, our guests will discuss this issue broadly, and then we will turn to audience questions. We've received a number of pre-submitted questions. You may also submit a question during the webinar. Please use the chat function on your screen or email events@fcltglobal.org. So let me introduce today's guests. Mark Wiseman is a Canadian investor and business executive. Mark served as president and CEO of CPP Investments, the organization that invests the assets of the Canada Pension Plan. And until last year, he was senior managing director at BlackRock. Importantly for us, Mark was co-founder of FCLT Global during his time at CPP Investments and BlackRock. Jay Clayton was nominated to the chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission in January 2017 by President Trump and was sworn in as chairman in May of 2017. Chairman Clayton is a member of the President's Working Group on Financial Metrics, the Financial Stability Board, and the Board of International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO. Prior to joining the commission, Chairman Clayton was a partner at Sullivan & Cromwell, where he was a member of the firm's management committee and co-head of the firm's corporate practice. So Mark, please let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and I'm delighted to be here with two good friends, both Sarah and Chairman Clayton. Thank you for making the time. Now, before we start, Jay, I did want to remind you this is not the new Senate confirmation hearing. This is about ESG disclosure. I know there's been a little bit of talk about a Senate confirmation hearing, so I didn't want you to be confused before we get going.
Only a friend could make a remark like that. Look, looks like that's a ways away. So let's focus on the job of the commission.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's do that, and let's talk specifically about disclosure. I'm going to start a little bit easy before we sort of get into it a little bit more deeply here. You recently said as part of your remarks at the Asset Management and Advisory Committee of the SEC about this idea of combining ES and G standards together into a single rating or a single score wouldn't really create meaningful disclosure or useful investment information. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because there has been a lot of work done on scoring systems and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit surprising to some that you would have said that.
Well, Mark, I think let's talk about that, because you're an investor, and anytime you try and combine metrics, particularly metrics that involve subjectivity and uncertainty, you increase subjectivity and uncertainty, and particularly if you add in preferences. So some people have a different preference on an E matter, an S matter, a G matter than others. Those preferences vary. You have subjectivity of the person who's compiling them, and then you have imprecision. And when you combine metrics that have that type of characteristics. I've joked about this. Ken Arrow won the Nobel Prize for proving that just variations in preferences make the value of a metric, a combined metric, decrease dramatically. His impossibility theorem. So I just want investors to understand that there are substantial limitations in using those kinds of combined, particularly single point ratings. Now, I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I'm supposed to be asking the questions here. I mean, I obviously, I obviously have concerns about that too. There are trade-offs because people want to be able to, particularly institutional investors, let's say endowments or pension funds, they want to be able to rate their portfolio. And so they need some way of being able to show, you could look at your portfolio and you might want to say, well, the average PE in my portfolio is X, or the average EBITDA multiple in the equities that I hold is Y. How are we meant to do that as it relates to understanding as an investor from a high level, sort of the quality of our portfolio as it relates to sustainability?
Well, I think with the examples you used, you identified some of the issues. And let me say that I have no fundamental objection to these types of issues being part of disclosure. In fact, it's clear to me that in many companies, there are E issues, S issues, and G issues that are very important, that are material to an investment decision. Let's just level set and make it clear that that is a fact, and they vary. But the examples that you used were historic metrics that have a fair amount of precision with them, and those types of ratings are different from many types of E, S, and G measurements. Not all of them, but many of them are forward-looking. And you might see projected EPS or something like that for portfolio ratings. You see very few forward-looking ratings. And so it's a long-winded way, but I think an important way of saying, in trying to develop metrics and trying to develop standards in this area, we are moving into somewhat uncharted territory, given the forward-looking nature, some of the subjectivity and uncertainty here.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with you. I think as soon as you start also combining more and more information into a single score, what you end up with is nothing, right? You lose all the granularity. And I would actually argue, and you and I have had this discussion previously, that even something like a PE multiple is useless, because you have to understand everything that underlies that. And if you wanted to rate your portfolio on your EBITDA multiple or your PE multiple, you're probably not a particularly sophisticated investor. But you did raise something that I think is interesting in there, which is about metrics. And one of the things that makes it really hard to sort of get good sustainability disclosure is this tension between wanting metrics and the fact that there isn't necessarily numeric data that can really help us the same way it can with financial data as it relates to ESG. So how do you think about that push and pull? And we've seen it with a lot of the organizations that are working in this area, between, let's call it, numerical disclosure and more narrative disclosure. How do you think about that as a regulator?
So that is the question of the day. Okay, like where can we use principles? Where can we use metrics? And how do we get comfort that we're getting to a meaningful place? We've discussed this a lot, particularly at IOSCO. I want to thank Eric Thedin. I don't know if people know him, but he's my counterpart from Sweden. He's worked incredibly hard. We've worked together to try and find a way forward on exactly this issue. And Mark, I start with how does management look at these issues? How does the management of the company that is managing for the long term, managers, I've met very few managers that are managing for the short term. They actually are managing for the long term. They want to be there. They want their shareholders to do well. They want their employees to do well. What metrics are they using? And have a dialogue with investors as to how they're using those metrics and principles. There are clearly industry segments where metrics of the quantitative type, fairly precise metrics, are developing. Property and casualty. People are looking at climate change, they're modeling it, focusing on those industries to see how you can get some standardization is a good thing to do. It's the kind of thing that we as securities regulators should encourage. Then on the qualitative side, how does management look at these things from the qualitative side? I can tell you, I don't want to advertise for any one metric setter or standard setter or another. That's not what I do. But when I look at disclosure, I will flip to those standard setters and some of their materiality heat maps to see if companies are actually sort of at least considering those issues. That type of dialogue, I think, is important. Let me let you drill down in any area you want.
Yeah, well, let me go on. If we go with this principles-based approach, I mean, don't we run the risk that we end up with disclosure all over the place? It becomes very hard for there to be comparability. We don't do financial statements on a principles-based approach. We have certain requirements in terms of what we want companies to disclose, very specific requirements in terms of what we want them to disclose. But here, why are we more comfortable sort of allowing a principles-based approach, which makes it very, very hard for there to be comparability?
Well, again, it goes back to the historic nature of financial statements, look, there are still many challenges. And if you take financial statements as your baseline, there's still many challenges in pulling together financial statements and making sure that they are comparable across even companies in the same sector. You know that as an investor. You look at the assumptions that people make going into their financial statements, whether it's in the financial sector or others. So you don't get away from those types of issues just by setting a metric. So let's be clear on that. It also goes back to the forward-looking nature. Like, let me give you an example. MD&A, okay? One of the most important parts of disclosure about financial information is the management's discussion analysis of financial condition results of operation. Those discussions, they have a lot of principles-based forward-looking type information about known trends and uncertainties. Those are some of the most important disclosures. So in the area of E in particular, I think that type of disclosure is the type of disclosure that I think is valuable. Does that
so if that's the case, I mean, the SEC, for example, provides some guidance of what should be in an MD&A, what type of discussion should be in there, and that's not all prescriptive. Some of that is in a sense very much principles based. So what do you think we say to issuers as it relates to sustainability? Is it just it's part of the MD&A? If it's material, you got to talk about it. I mean, how do we make sure as we know that these, as an investor, I know that these issues, particularly as a long-term investor, are more and more important to me making my investment decisions, right? And I want as much information as I can, and I want high quality information in that regard. So does the regulator have a role in providing some guidance around that? Because we're going to come to it in a few minutes.
Absolutely. We've provided guidance around e-disclosure. We've been reviewing filings. Our division of corporation finance has been reviewing those filings as the landscape for what investors believe is material, and as our, when I say that I mean societal approach to e-issues has changed. We have been updating those comments. I expect at some time we will update the guidance. Let me turn to a current event that shows the importance of this approach. Our unprecedented response to COVID.
I was about to mention that.
No, there are no COVID metrics sitting on the shelf, okay? But our division of corporation finance did an unbelievable job getting out guidance to issuers to how to communicate with the investment community on operational effects, health and safety of employees, preserving the health and safety of employees and customers. What does that do to you operationally? How are you going to adjust your operations? What does that mean for your financial condition? Have you been able to adjust your liquidity profile to deal with the fact that you're operating in a constrained environment? And it's the women and men of the SEC have put out very robust guidance to help facilitate issuer-investor communication around principles of materiality, and including a lot of things that people would never have thought of. And we want to do that as a regulator in every space.
Yeah, and I will say, I was going to use that as an example because, so is that where you, because I thought that was, first of all, it came quick. It was quite detailed. It was easy to understand though, I think for both issuers and investors. So is that where you think we need to go as it relates to ESG, the same sort of approach? Because that seemed very sensible. But again, comparability, and then I want to ask you also about assurance and auditability, how you feel about that. But first and foremost, is that the direction you think we ought to go?
I do think it's the direction we ought to go, driven by, and that guidance was sector, and it's just a very good example how different industries, different companies are going to have different reactions to an issue like that. Same with E issues in particular, and that's why I always really try hard to separate E, S, and G, because from a disclosure perspective, they're actually quite different. E is very forward-looking in many ways. You can look at current outputs and things like that in certain industries, but it's how am I going to get to a different place, or how is a different place, depending on how you estimate, going to affect me. S is issues that are certainly different from that. We've put out additional disclosure guidance around diversity in the boardroom that I think has improved the disclosure, and improved the disclosure in a way that's both good for companies and good for investors. And then on G, Mark, G is an area where I don't know how much more disclosure we can have in terms of G disclosure. I mean, that's always an interesting topic for me. I'm open all the time to what G metrics people want, but we do have it's very easy to understand the governance structure of our public companies. So, that's kind of, now auditability, again, the more forward-looking something is, the more estimates are required, the more difficult it is to provide, I would say, certainty to a level that's audited. Even in financial disclosure, accountants do not audit numbers like backlog, which has, although it's named backlog, it inherently has a forward-looking nature to it. So we should remember that. Now, are we of the view that because it's forward-looking, you get a pass? Absolutely not. Yeah, these have to be good faith estimates, grounded in understandable assumptions, and consistent with the way that management looks at the business. But whether that rises to the level of auditability in the traditional financial sense, that's difficult. We should be looking at how people disclose their assumptions, and whether in fact those assumptions are consistent with the way management looks at the business.
Now, you talk about management, and you and I have talked in the past about the role of the board, and you've said, and I'll paraphrase it, but you've said in the past, you believe that investors should have available to them the key issues, disclosure on the key issues that are being discussed at around the boardroom table. So if it's material for the board, it ought to be material for investors. First of all, do you agree with that, and particularly as it relates to the topic at hand? And secondly, how do you know the board's doing its job in that regard? What if the board is asleep at the switch as it relates to these issues, and we're not getting, as a result, the information we need?
So first, yes, of course, as anything that's complicated in life with limitations, boards should not be disclosing when they're in merger negotiations, obviously, right? You got to wait. Very material, but you have to wait. There are things that you have to wait on. But as an overriding principle, if matters are rising to the board level, they should be reflected in the disclosure to the public. Right? That's just kind of a fundamental way that I look at the world. I think it's the way our disclosure rules are built. In terms of how do we know, that's where I think investor-issuer dialogue is really important. Okay, I do think that earnings calls are important. We may get into the issue of alternative data. I do like it that sophisticated investors use alternative data to sort of benchmark whether the disclosed data and disclosed information in fact comports with what they're seeing in other places. Like we like that investors, sophisticated investors, work for all investors. When sophisticated investors are in there asking questions, checking the metrics, probing management, that's a good thing for all investors.
So I want to come back to the alternative data question because that's an area that I've got a lot of interest in. But I want to I want to pick up a couple other threads first. Behind you it says Securities and Exchange Commission. Underneath it says the investors advocate. So I want to talk about that phrase as it relates to disclosure around sustainability and sustainability metrics. Who should this disclosure be for in your view? Because that is something, there's a lot of reasons to disclose this information beyond potentially just to make an investment decision. Does that matter?
Well, it does, but you have to be measured as a regulator. So you can't have a system where someone says, I'm an investor, I care, you need to tell me, and then have the 50,000 other investors each have their idiosyncratic requests. So that's why we have built our system around materiality, material to an investment decision, for what a reasonable investor, your reasonable investor would think. Now, people sometimes think that when I say that, that just means financial. No, it doesn't. Let me be clear. No, it doesn't. The reasonable investor looks at qualitative, quantitative, non-financial and financial metrics and is interested in those. And it's that reasonable investor looking out over materiality. And look, everybody has somebody in their mind. Mine is somebody who's the long-term retail investor. Now, what is it that they want the disclosure to be? And let's both recognize that most retail investors aren't digesting disclosure. Some do. It's great. We love it. We want it to be there for them. But it's largely the institutional investors that digest it. But they are digesting it on behalf of the market as a whole. And that's a very important thing to recognize.
Now I want to push on you a little bit here because the EU, and I want to spend a few minutes in it talking just to prepare you about the different view between Europe and the US. But I want to start because the EU non-financial reporting directive, they seem to make it quite clear if you read their work that what they really care about is disclosure. They want to know about impact of a corporation on, as they say it, I think, people on the planet. Mm-hmm. That's a little bit different than saying it's information just for investors. What is your view? What is your view on that? Do you take a similar view, or is it just information that would be relevant to that institutional, sophisticated investor that matters?
So this is not let me be clear. This is not a duck of this question, but our mandate does not cover that breadth. Okay, that's not what our regulatory mandate. That's not what our authority covers. And I try to make it clear that we stay within our authority and our mandate, and do so in a very, I would say, hopefully a very effective way. But within our authority and our mandate, lots of information that companies provide is relevant way beyond the investing community. And I think that's great. I think if there are benefits like that, that's terrific. To the extent that people with other authorities believe that those disclosures should be supplemented, that's for them. But I think Mark, we should recognize that when you're starting to get out of those other issues, focusing only on public companies, you're missing a lot.
So that's it. That's an important. I think this is a really important point. And I don't disagree with you because I think otherwise you're the SEC. You're not the government, and there may be other parts of government or other that require. There's all kinds of disclosure that's required for anybody operating, be they public or private companies. The issue, I guess, for me as an investor who has to operate in this world, and if I were an issuer, the issue would be that now I've got to deal, though, with this complex sort of panoply of different disclosures. And in particular, it would appear, and we don't have our colleagues from the EU on the line, maybe we'll do another panel with them if they're willing. But there's a real risk that we end up with yet another divide between what Europe is looking for and what European regulators are looking for, who may have maybe more of a dual mandate or than the SEC does, and what we're required in the US. And I look at it and I say, boy, oh boy, we're going to force issuers to kind of, especially global issuers, to default to the European rules. Is that, do you think, what's going to happen here? Because it sort of happened in MiFID II, right?
Well, it did happen in MiFID II, and this is not a panel on MiFID II, but it's interesting that there are a lot of questions as to whether that was effective. That's, some parts of anything are always effective, but overall, yeah, I mean, you can shake your head.
No, it may or may not have been effective, but at the end of the day, as an issuer, because of a lack of let's say coordination or this divergent approach to the issue, and not saying one's right or one's the other, it's just the fact that they're divergent makes life really, really hard.
Absolutely, and that is one of the reasons, and it's reciprocal. It's one I mentioned Eric before. It's one of the reasons I devoted a substantial amount of time to the work of IOSCO and the FSB, and my colleagues from Europe do as well, because we recognize that while authorities may be different, scope of authority, enforcement mechanisms may be different, mandates may be different, we've got to try to work together, because what we do have right now are many, many companies that are global in nature.
Right, and it's hard for the issuer, and it also makes it very hard for the investor, because now the investor's looking at a bunch of different disclosure. One company's operating in Europe, one company's operating in Asia, one company's operating in the US. If they're global, they may disclose all three, they may disclose. So how do we get greater coordination?
Well, we're trying. I mean, I think we have. I feel that we have much better coordination today than we did a decade ago. I really do. We talk a lot. We talk, in the sustainability work of IOSCO, we talk at a very granular level. At the FSB, we talk. I think that the recent COVID market disruptions have demonstrated how much we talk. Our disclosure guidance benefited from interaction with our IOSCO colleagues, and I think the IOSCO disclosure guidance that came out benefited from their interaction with us. So we're making progress. But let me just make a point that's important here. In our securities area, and please take this as nothing other than an endorsement of this approach, an absolute endorsement of this approach. We place heavy responsibility on people to make accurate disclosure. We provide private rights of action if disclosure is materially inaccurate and people lose money. That is unique around the globe. And you have to remember that when we institute disclosure obligations, and no one disputes this, they come with greater responsibility here in the US than they do other places. That doesn't mean you don't do them. It just means you recognize that you are doing something different when you do it here.
I want to pick up on a small point you made, and you talked a little bit about the difference between public companies and private companies and the types of disclosure that they're required to make. Today, despite your best efforts, public markets, number of issuers continues to shrink. The private markets become bigger and bigger. That's an area where I've operated much of my investment career in the private markets. What do we do about private companies? What type of disclosure should we require of them? You talked about, for example, I'll just use one example to take it away from, make it very simple. You talked about the amount of disclosure is of public companies as it relates to the G factor, and I agree with you. There's not much more you could want. You may not like the answer, but there's not much more you could want to know. Yet for private companies, and there's very large ones out there that have a very large impact on the economy. Some of them may even have systemic impacts on the economy or parts of it that have very little requirements to disclose these types of things. Should there be a higher degree of scrutiny and higher degree of disclosure requirements for private companies? Or if you're just about being a public investor and you're just the investor's advocate, it ought not to matter?
Well, look, you are outlining a number of areas of sort of.
I'm just trying to expand the scope of the SEC, Jay. You should be very happy about that.
Well, that's the point I was going to make. That in order for me to answer that question, I need a lot. I need a lot more authority. But it's a great question because I think if you started sort of fundamentals and investors in private company investors, when you were a private company investor, I'm guessing that you got the information that you wanted to make your investment decisions. So that's not the issue you're talking about. You're talking about the issue of disclosure beyond the investors and what it means more generally for society. And that clearly is not, our area of authority. But we should get to that issue of data and alternative data and what data is out there and the like, because let's face it, from not just a securities perspective. Now I'm taking a step back and just making an observation, not a request for anything, being careful to stay in my lane. Let's say the amount of data that is available about companies and individuals is pretty vast, indirect data. And how is that going to affect the way we look at companies going forward is an interesting question.
Yeah, and I've talked about that in the past. And so let me tell you my view. My view, and this relates, I think, to ESG and sustainability metrics, but it actually relates to a whole bunch of just general business metrics. And what I've said in the past is that that's going to be the stuff that's actually really important for investors, particularly investors who are active and want to generate alpha, to be able to utilize, because the markets are efficient. They're highly efficient, and most information gets digested incredibly quickly. So what I've often advocated is that there's going to be an increasing need, particularly for active investors, to utilize proprietary alternative data in order to make better investment decisions. Now, people have been doing that for a long time, and you can sit outside a store and click the number of customers that are going in, or there's the famous stories of people sitting in the port of Rotterdam with their binoculars looking at the ballast line on tankers coming in, and so on and so forth. But as it becomes big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence becomes more and more core to what active investors do, and as investors are able in some cases to get hold contractually or otherwise of proprietary information, there's good and bad potentially that comes of that. And how do you think about that? And then how do you think about that having an impact on sustainability?
So I want to say I'm so happy that the women and men of the SEC organically started thinking about this, and we've been in dialogue on this because it does create some real issues for how we look at our markets. Let me give you an example. Many people, including in some ways myself, are frustrated with the idea that people manage for the short term, that they manage for quarterly earnings, and that they have to try and meet their guidance. Yes. And we're looking at that and how to have our disclosure be for the longer term investor and make sure that people feel that they can tell that longer term story. That said, if you go to less than quarterly reporting, that alternative data becomes all the more important, because it is the data that would give people who had it an advantage between when the company last updated and next updated. So I sort of went into the idea of looking at quarterly reporting and how can we make it less burdensome. I think we still can, but I don't think we can do that by increasing the periods of reporting, given all of this real-time data that investors are using. Because
And by the way, I'll tell you, as sort of the guy who helped found FCLT Global, which is all about long-termism, people have often said, well, you must just want, you don't want quarterly reporting. And I think that's a red herring, because I don't think being long-term means less transparency. I don't think that's a trade-off.
And I think we can substantially improve quarterly reporting and the like. There are things we can do, but the idea that people aren't going to be thirsting for information, we can't. That's a fact, and there's lots of information out there, and we need that check from companies that the alternative information is. So if people are looking at sort of monthly sales data and they're projecting how a company's doing, you want either a monthly or quarterly check-in from the company. Otherwise, the market expectations in the company are going to get out of whack.
No, that's different. You're saying something different though than advocating quarterly guidance.
Oh yes. Obviously that's a choice for companies to make, but I think that many investors believe that managing for quarterly guidance is not an effective management style, strategy, perspective for the long term.
And I agree with you on that one too, as does Sarah. So I see her smiling in the top right of my screen. And FCLT has done a lot of work around quarterly guidance, and there's not that many issuers left doing that, particularly in the U.S. I just want to come back though and push a little bit on this alternative data piece. Is it fair to say from your comments though that you're comfortable that if I'm a sophisticated investor, an unsophisticated investor, that's what makes a market, and if I can access information to help do that, that's okay? No,
I'm not saying that with a blanket. Okay, let's.
I was looking for that exemptive order in this discussion.
Not coming. I love the binoculars in Rotterdam, which I think have been replaced by satellite imagery to check whether people think that tankers are actually full or not when people say they are or aren't. Those types of things, and people gathering data like that. But it's got to be done in a fair way, right? You can't gather that data from somebody who has an obligation to keep it confidential and then trade on it. That's kind of like fundamental to the way we look at our securities laws. And I'm making a broad brush statement there, but we want to encourage people to generate and get data to inform their investment decisions in a fair way. We definitely want to discourage them from doing it in an unfair way, and our insider trading laws are built around that.
I could probably spend an hour pushing you on that statement. I'm gonna let it go because there's several degrees of granularity around it.
Mark, I admit that I laid out two ends of the spectrum, and as always in life, the difficulty is getting it right in between.
Speaking about ends of the spectrum, in this case, it may not be a spectrum. It may be more of I want to move back a little bit, and I want to talk and get a little bit maybe of advice from you. I was speaking earlier this week, preparing for this discussion with Connor Kehoe, who's the chair of the IRC. Been doing a lot of reading and getting myself up to speed on everything going on in this area around disclosure, and maybe a little bit of advice from you would be helpful, because when I look out there, we've got SASB, we've got TCFD, we've got GRI, we've got the World Economic Forum, we've got an alphabet soup of organizations that are all working around trying to get better disclosure around ESG and sustainability. What advice do you have for, let's call it, whether it's the public interest advocacy area or the sort of investor area around this topic? Because there's so much out there. And if I was an issuer today and I looked at all that, I would almost want to throw my hands up in the air and say, I want to comply, I want to be helpful, I want to provide disclosure, but how do I deal with the alphabet soup of groups out there? What advice would you give to them, if you could be so bold as to do so?
To the issuers, or to
both to the issuers, but also to to all of us, many of us who are involved in these advocacy groups, who are, I think, all working towards directionally to the same sort of outcome.
Yeah, let me call it more of an observation on the circumstance and how I look at this. And you have the many organizations engaged in what I would call is a top-down approach to this issue. The other side, you have the public companies, and I think in large part, we're talking about, let's just pick a number. You tell me if I'm picking the right number. 5,000 to 10,000 public issuers worldwide.
Good number.
Okay. They're approaching this on a bottoms-up basis. How do we look at these issues for managing the business over time? Now, depends on the industry, depends on the circumstance, how they're doing that. Like I said, I think if you're looking at the E area and climate change, the property and casualty industry is one that is approaching it with great interest. Other industries, it's less effect, so less focus, or they're actually just going to be takers. When I say takers, they're going to be their activities are going to be driven by factors beyond their control. So you've got that, but there's not a lot of dialogue that is aimed at matching those two perspectives. There's some. We try very hard through our guidance to issuers to issue comments, give them information, say, have you thought about this? And believe me, those comments that we make on issuer disclosure, they're driven by what's in those top-down studies. Have you thought about this in the way you disclose these things? But to bridge that gap, you need to come together. And that's easy to say, but that's what we should be working on doing.
All right, easier said than done, but it makes a lot of sense. I'd suggest, this is my last jab on this topic, from an investor's and an issuer point of view. I hope that global regulators, particularly the U.S. and Europe, can do the same, even more than you're doing through IOSCO and otherwise. Because I think that and I'm going to ask one more after this, and then I'll go to sort of audience questions. But I do think that the end game here is important. And if we don't have the end game, may be very, very muddled otherwise, and I think that would be unfortunate.
And look, Mark, like anything, the top down and the bottom up, it's going to get better the more each side believes engaging with the other creates value.
And we say the same thing about issuers and investors.
Yeah.
I want to ask one more question, and I think this is an incredibly important one. We know that the SEC has taken measures in support of racial and gender diversity in regulated entities. In this moment, and it should be in every moment, but particularly in this moment, when there's a strong desire to push for meaningful progress around corporate diversity, how do you view the role of disclosure? How do you view the role of the SEC around these issues? Should it be mandatory? Should it be voluntary? And also, how do you view the role of investors? I happen to believe that more diverse companies are more profitable companies. That's where I come from. And that's diversity at every level of a company, from the board through management on down. But what's the role of the SEC, and how are you thinking about this important issue?
Well, let me say how I think about it first as a manager of a 5,500 person organization. I agree with what you said, and we try to institute that throughout the fabric of the SEC in an inclusive, diverse environment where people respect each other and provide opportunities and recognize that they may have unconscious biases, that there is racism in the world, that there is bias, and that we try and strive to get past that as a company, at the SEC as an organization, and come to grips with it in a candid way. That's what you should be doing. That's what we're doing, and we've been doing it In light of recent events, it's become a much more increased focus and dialogue, but that should not fade with time. And I completely agree with you that in 30 years of looking at companies and being around companies, the inclusive companies that provide opportunities and have diverse perspectives function better for everybody. So that's my personal perspective on companies and how we approach things here at the SEC. On disclosure, this is a tough issue. We have enhanced our guidance around board disclosure. We expect there to be disclosure if people have self-identified with certain characteristics, and the board takes that into account in making up the composition of the board. We expect that to be disclosed. We believe that that's information that's material to investors. I think beyond that, we're looking at it, and this is a bigger issue than just the SEC.
Certainly is. Certainly is. I'm going to move. Thank you for that. And I think there's a long way to go. My personal view is that the more disclosure and transparency we have, the better position we are going to be in to address it. And as I said,
and let me say this, Mark. One of the things about disclosure, internal disclosure and transparency, as the operator of an organization, I have come to learn that internal disclosure and transparency is extremely important.
I agree. Thank you. I'm gonna go to a few audience questions here. There's a lot. I'm gonna try and sort through them and see if we can in the next 10 minutes or so get through a few of them. Here's one, and I'll just read it verbatim. There's often a trade-off between liquidity and long-term investing, and long-term mutual fund investors, for example, seem to subsidize those who trade frequently. The SEC is often worried about the ability to trade. Is it also concerned with encouraging long-term investing?
So look, I'll just say that my favorite investor, and the one that's in my mind, as I mentioned before, is that long-term retail investor who building wealth over time. We hope we give them low-cost, transparent access to an array of investment opportunities. But when you have 50 million households, at any one point, you're going to have a lot of them who need liquidity, and so we do need liquidity in our markets, even to serve the long-term investors. And that's something that we should all recognize, that you need a mix of investors, long-term, short-term, people who are market professionals, in order to have an effective capital market. Now, the question that the person who submitted the comment raised is one that is very much on our minds, and that is, are those frictions, those costs of liquidity, something that are fairly spread over the investing public? And the best way to deal with that is try to reduce those frictions as much as possible without jeopardizing liquidity. And that's what we've been trying to do.
Do you think, Jay, that investors are long-term enough? There's a loaded one for the guy who founded FCLT Global.
Let's put it this way. I think we have a lot of long-term investors who are very important, not only to the markets, but they're important to the economy writ large. I mean, the confidence to tie your money up for 10, 20, 30 years, and that a large section of our market is willing to do that, that's of tremendous value from a capital allocation standpoint. Let me turn your question around a little bit. I think what you may be saying is, are there too many short-term investors? Or is short-term investing activity driving too much of today's market prices? Yeah, always a worry. Do we have enough people to take the other side of that kind of volatility? the best way to deal with that is transparency. It's the best way to deal with that. And if anybody's acting nefariously, to catch them.
I like that answer. I'm going to leave it there just so we can. I could go on with that debate for another hour, but let's leave it there so I get to a couple more questions. Here's another one. How does the SEC approach the disclosure of public company spending on political activities, lobbying, campaign donations, etc.? Do investors have a right to know how the companies that they own are spending their money for political activities?
So I have to. We're in somewhat of a unique circumstance around work on that and whatnot. But the status quo is that this has largely been something that's evolved as a result of shareholder company interaction. And it seems that from when you look at proxy questions around this, shareholder submissions and the like, that by and large, the investment community and companies have settled on an appropriate, or at least a disclosure framework that folks are largely satisfied with. But that's where I'm going to have to leave that one.
Here's another one. Can you clarify your view of fiduciary duty and financial materiality? And I think this is an interesting question because there's several layers to it. But how should one consider ESG risks that might be material in the long run, like climate change? So I think it goes back to the question we talked about: what's being discussed in the boardroom, what's not being discussed in the boardroom. But how do you view the fiduciary duty around that disclosure? And I think the question is saying, how do we determine what's material and what's not, and particularly in a principles-based environment?
Well, like I said, that's why that is important to have a principles-based. Again, going back to my sort of binary example, the property and casualty company that does a lot of insurance along the coasts, I think it'd be hard to find one where climate modeling and climate change were not material to that company. On the other hand, the cabinet manufacturer in the middle of the country, it's going to be an issue for them, but it's probably going to be an issue for them that they can't control. It's really a matter of cost of materials. Their cost of materials is going to change as a result of changes in climate or changes in regulation and the like. And so how they consider it and whether it's part of the fiduciary duty of how they manage it, think about how different that is in terms of the types of conversations that you're going to be having if you're managing the company for the long term, which hopefully they both are.
There's another question which is kind of good.
Let me just go back to that and say, it's clearly part of your fiduciary duty in some companies.
So let me ask this question, and I see Sarah's kind of giving me a bit of a look. So this may be the last one. I may try and squeeze in one more. But this one's sort of an interesting. They weren't asked together, but it's sort of an interesting question, which is, it says, given that regulatory scrutiny is often raised as an impediment to non-traditional metrics disclosure, would the SEC consider a safe harbor for certain metrics, particularly if they were assured by an auditor? So I think what the question is getting at, if you go to your previous point, it says, well, I'm the cabinet maker, or I have warehouses that are close to the sea. I'm a little bit worried that if I make that type of disclosure, that I may be creating a risk related to the quality of that disclosure. Would you consider? Should the SEC consider giving its safe harbor to certain types of sustainable disclosure?
Look, we have, I think 97, 98, I'm trying to remember exactly the date. We've provided a safe harbor for forward-looking statements. I do think that that's an important safe harbor. We want to encourage people to provide that kind of forward-looking information that helps people make decisions. We want it to be based on, reasonable assumptions. And like I always say, the same, range of assumptions that are being made by management in the boardroom. That is something that we want to encourage. And in the area of sustainability, I'm very open to a dialogue around encouraging the use of the safe harbor in order to get more information out to investors.
I think it's absolutely critical, and I'm delighted. I'm delighted to hear you say that. Maybe I'll give you the last word in a second. I think this has been a fabulous discussion. I think, as usual, you've been incredibly open. Your view around principles-based disclosure is very clear. I think it's also my personal view, and you and I have discussed this, that it's incumbent on investors to do a better job as well. And I think there's a big gap today between the talk and the walk around sustainability and ESG. I think a lot of investors talk about the importance, but I think if you drill down, very, very few today are actually implementing, and it's hard. It's hard to do it. We've got to reteach ourselves to utilize this non-financial information in a way that helps us make better investment decisions. So the regulators have to do their part. Issuers have to do their part. Investors, I believe, also have a big part to play in terms of equipping themselves better and becoming more expert in understanding how to make better investment decisions from this type of information that we keep asking for, but we actually have to utilize it. Before I turn it to Sarah, Jay, anything that you want to add or ask our audience to specifically take away before we close?
Just one thing, in addition to thanks to both you and Sarah for this dialogue. I think it's a very good thing, and that's the one thing, which is with investors, with issuers, and with others, the best thing here is engagement. Yeah. How are you looking at this? How are you driving value for your long-term investors? The more engagement, the better.
Thank you. Sarah.
All right. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jay, for that terrific discussion. And I like the way you've ended that on thinking about the importance of the long-term investor, the importance of the engagement between the investor and the issuer, the importance of global cooperation. As we continue to work on these metrics and disclosures, we are really interested in having those sorts of conversations, bringing those issuers, or the top down, the bottom up together, as you've talked about. So thank you all to people who have dialed in. We appreciate your comments and your ongoing input. Please send us more comments at fcltglobal.org. And again, just thank you both so much for progressing this conversation and thinking about the importance of these metrics and disclosures. So thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark.